I missed my son's wedding helping a lady in a wheelchair up the hill. My daughter-in-law laughed at my messy hair. "Look at you, pathetic." I sat outside. Suddenly, a helicopter landed. The lady's handsome son stepped out. He kissed my dirty hand, handed me a rose, and said, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." My name is Helene, and I'm 69 years old. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, my son Nolan's wedding day. Instead, it became the day I finally understood that some people see love as weakness and kindness as something to be ashamed of. I had spent $89 on a navy blue dress from the discount store. $89 might not sound like much, but when your monthly pension is $850 and your rent is $600, every purchase requires careful consideration. I saved for 3 months to buy that dress, skipping meals here and there, walking instead of taking the bus. I wanted to look perfect for my son's special day. The Whitmore estate was everything I had imagined and more. Sprawling gardens filled with white roses and jasmine, their sweet fragrance mixing with the warm September air. Crystal chandeliers hung from a massive white tent, casting rainbow reflections across the perfectly manicured lawn. A string quartet played softly near the altar, where white silk draped elegantly between marble columns. Everything was pristine, expensive, and intimidating. I clutched my small purse tighter as I approached the entrance, smoothing down my dress one last time. The fabric was simple polyester, but I had pressed it carefully and even managed to find shoes that matched reasonably well. I felt nervous but hopeful. After all, this was my son getting married. Surely today would be different. Surely today, Tegan would see past whatever had made her dislike me and welcome me into this important moment. I was wrong. "Excuse me, ma'am." A young woman in a crisp white shirt and black skirt appeared beside me. "Are you on the guest list?" "Yes, of course. I'm Helene Morrison, Nolan's mother." The woman's expression shifted slightly. She glanced toward the entrance, then back at me. "Please wait here for just a moment." My stomach began to twist. Something was wrong. I watched as she hurried toward the tent, her heels clicking against the stone pathway. She spoke quietly to another woman, who then disappeared inside. Minutes passed. The other guests walked past me, their designer gowns rustling, their jewelry catching the afternoon light. I felt increasingly out of place in my discount dress. Then I saw her. Tegan emerged from the tent, her wedding dress a masterpiece of silk and lace that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. She was beautiful. I couldn't deny that. Tall, elegant, with perfectly styled blonde hair and makeup that looked like it belonged in a magazine. But when her eyes found mine, they were as cold as winter glass. "Helene." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "I need to speak with you." She walked toward me, her train flowing behind her like liquid moonlight. Other guests had begun to notice our interaction, their conversations growing quieter as they watched. "Tegan, you look absolutely beautiful," I said, trying to inject warmth into my voice. "I'm so happy for you and Nolan. I brought a gift, and I was hoping—" "Stop." Her voice cut through my words like a blade. "We need to discuss something." My heart began to race. "What is it, dear?" She looked me up and down slowly, her gaze lingering on my dress, my shoes, my simple pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. When her eyes met mine again, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Disgust. "This is a very important day for our family," she began, her voice low enough that the nearby guests had to strain to hear. "We have some very influential people here today. Business associates, politicians, people who matter in society." I nodded, not understanding where this was leading but feeling increasingly anxious. "The thing is, Helene, we've decided that it would be best if you didn't attend the ceremony." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward. "What? But I'm his mother. I'm Nolan's mother." "Yes, And that's exactly why this is so difficult. Her tone suggested it wasn't difficult for her at all. You see, appearances matter in our social circle. People judge families by their weakest links, and honestly, having you here dressed like that, it would reflect poorly on Nolan's reputation. My mouth opened, but no words came. I felt as if all the air had been sucked from my lungs. "I'm sure you understand," she continued, her voice taking on a false sweetness that somehow made it worse. "This isn't personal. It's just that we need to maintain certain standards. Perhaps you could attend the reception later, after the important guests have left." "Tegan, please." My voice was barely a whisper. "I saved for months for this dress. I've been looking forward to this day since you got engaged. I just want to see my son get married." Something flickered across her face, annoyance perhaps at my persistence. "Helene, you need to accept reality. This family has a certain image to maintain. Nolan has worked very hard to build his career, and I won't let anything jeopardize that. Your presence here, looking the way you do, speaking the way you do, it would be embarrassing for all of us." The cruelty of her words was breathtaking. I looked past her toward the tent, hoping to catch a glimpse of Nolan, hoping he would appear and tell me this was all a terrible mistake. But he was nowhere to be seen. "Does Nolan know about this?" I asked. "Of course he knows. This was a mutual decision. He agrees that it's for the best." That hurt more than anything else she could have said. My son, the baby I had raised alone after his father left, the child I had worked 2 jobs to support, the boy I had loved unconditionally for 42 years. He had agreed to exclude me from his wedding because I wasn't good enough for his new life. "I see." My voice sounded strange, distant, as if it was coming from someone else. "I understand." Tegan's smile was triumphant. "I knew you would be reasonable about this. Perhaps you could send a nice card instead." She turned and walked away, her dress trailing behind her like a white river of rejection. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching the other guests enter the tent, listening to the music begin, smelling the roses that now seemed to mock me with their perfection. A few people stared at me as they passed. Some looked curious, others pitying. One elderly woman even started to approach me, but her husband pulled her away, whispering something in her ear that made her glance back at me with a mixture of sympathy and embarrassment. I turned and walked away from the tent, away from the music and laughter and celebration that I wasn't worthy to witness. My feet carried me down the long driveway, past the perfectly trimmed hedges and the fountain that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Behind me, I could hear the ceremony beginning, the officiant's voice carrying on the warm breeze. My son was getting married, and I wasn't there to see it. I had no car. I had planned to catch a ride home with one of the other family members after the reception. Now I faced the prospect of walking the 3 miles home in my good shoes, which were already beginning to pinch my feet. But that seemed like the least of my problems. As I reached the main road, I heard a sound that made me stop. Someone was crying. Not the gentle tears of wedding joy, but the desperate, frustrated sobs of someone in real trouble. The crying was coming from somewhere up ahead, around a bend in the road where a steep hill rose toward the old part of town. I hesitated for a moment. Part of me just wanted to go home, crawl into bed, and try to forget this entire day had happened. But the sound was so desperate, so filled with anguish that I couldn't ignore it. I walked toward the sound, my feet already aching in the shoes I had bought specifically for the wedding I hadn't been allowed to attend. As I rounded the corner, I saw her. An elderly woman sat in a wheelchair at the bottom of a steep hill, her hands gripping the wheels as she tried unsuccessfully to propel herself up the incline. She was maybe 73 or 74, with silver hair that had come loose from what had probably been a neat bun. Her dress was simple but clean, a soft gray cotton that looked handmade. She was crying from frustration and exhaustion, her face flushed from the effort of trying to move up the hill. "Ma'am," I called out as I approached, "are you all right? Do you need help?" She looked up at me, and I saw eyes that held the same kind of pain I had just experienced, the pain of being forgotten, of struggling alone. Her face was lined with age, but still held traces of the beauty she must have been in her youth. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes with a tissue that had seen better days. "I didn't mean to make a scene. I've been trying to get up this hill for the better part of an hour, but I just can't seem to manage it." I looked up the hill. It was indeed steep, probably a 20-degree incline that would be challenging for anyone in a wheelchair, especially someone her age trying to do it alone. "Where are you trying to go?" I asked, already moving behind her wheelchair. "Oak Hill Cemetery," she said. "It's just over the top of this hill. I take the bus here every year, but they changed the route last month. The driver told me this was the closest stop, but I didn't realize." She gestured helplessly at the incline. I didn't hesitate. I placed my hands on the handles of her wheelchair and began to push. The hill was every bit as steep as it looked, and within minutes, I was breathing hard. My dress was sticking to my back with sweat, and I could feel my carefully styled hair beginning to come undone. But something about helping this woman felt right in a way that nothing had felt right all day. "Oh, my dear, are you sure?" the woman asked. "This is quite an undertaking. I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition at all," I said, though I was already slightly out of breath. "I'm Helene." "Margaret," she replied. "Margaret Patterson, and I can't thank you enough for this." As we made our way slowly up the hill, Margaret began to talk. Perhaps it was the kindness of a stranger that opened her heart, or perhaps she simply needed someone to listen. Whatever the reason, her story unfolded as we climbed. "I'm going to visit my husband," she said. "Harold. Today would have been our 55th wedding anniversary, but he passed away 15 years ago." "I'm so sorry," I said, adjusting my grip on the wheelchair handles. "He was a good man," Margaret continued. "We had one son, Michael. Harold was so proud of him. Michael's done very well for himself. He's a successful businessman now, travels all over the world. But he's so busy, you know. I haven't seen him in, it must be 8 months now." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a quiet sadness that I recognized all too well. The loneliness of being left behind by the people you love most. "I'm sure he thinks about you often," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Perhaps," Margaret said. "He calls sometimes, usually on holidays. He sends money for my care. He's very generous that way. I live in a nice assisted living facility thanks to him. But money isn't the same as presents, is it?" No, it wasn't. I thought about Nolan, about all the times over the years when he had sent me a check instead of visiting, when he had called instead of coming by, when he had gradually pulled away as Tegan's influence grew stronger. "What about you, dear?" Margaret asked as we reached the halfway point of the hill. "Do you have family?" The question hit me unexpectedly hard. Did I have family? Technically, yes. Realistically. After today, I wasn't so sure. "I have a son," I said carefully. "His name is Nolan. He got married today." "How wonderful." Margaret's voice brightened. "You must be so happy. Was it a beautiful ceremony?" I stopped pushing for a moment, my hands tightening on the wheelchair handles. The irony of the question was almost too much to bear. I didn't actually attend," I said quietly. Margaret turned her head to look at me, her eyes searching my face. "Oh, my dear. Was it a destination wedding? One of those expensive affairs that families sometimes can't afford?" "No," I said, resuming our climb. "It was here in town. I wasn't invited." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Margaret didn't ask for details, didn't press for explanations. She simply reached back and patted my hand where it gripped her wheelchair. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "Family can be complicated." As we neared the top of the hill, Margaret's story continued to unfold. She told me about Harold, about how they had met at a church social when she was 19 and he was 21, about their early years together, struggling to make ends meet while Harold worked his way through engineering school. About the joy they felt when Michael was born, and how Harold had worked double shifts to ensure their son could have the opportunities they never had. Harold was so proud when Michael graduated from college, Margaret said as we finally crested the hill. He said it made all the sacrifice worth it. He believed that giving your children a better life was the most important thing a parent could do. But then, she said, something had changed. Michael's success had come with a price. The better life they had given him had somehow convinced him that his old life, including his parents, wasn't good enough anymore. It started slowly, Margaret explained as we approached the cemetery gates. He moved to the city for work, which was natural. But then the visits became shorter. The calls became less frequent. When he introduced us to his colleagues, we could see the embarrassment in his eyes. We weren't sophisticated enough for his new world. My heart ached for her, but also for myself. Her story was too familiar, too close to my own experience with Nolan. Harold was hurt by it, but he never said anything, Margaret continued. He believed that a parent's job was to love unconditionally, even when that love wasn't returned in kind. He said that Michael's success was worth any personal sacrifice we had to make. We had reached the cemetery entrance. Oak Hill Cemetery was old and peaceful, with towering oak trees that cast dappled shadows across weathered headstones. The air smelled of cut grass and old roses, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed quietly. Harold's grave is just over there, Margaret said, pointing toward a section of newer headstones under a large oak tree. I come here every year on our anniversary. I bring him roses, red ones. They were his favorite. I pushed her wheelchair along the winding path between the graves. Many of the headstones were elaborate, carved from expensive granite with intricate designs. Harold Patterson's marker was simpler, a modest gray stone with his name, dates, and a simple inscription, "Beloved husband and father." Margaret sat quietly for a moment, just looking at the grave. Then she reached into a small bag attached to her wheelchair and pulled out a single red rose. It was slightly wilted from the heat and the long journey, but it was still beautiful. "Hello, Harold," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I made it again this year. I had some help this time. I want you to meet Helene. She's an angel." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. This woman, abandoned by her son, struggling with mobility and age, had still made this difficult journey to honor her husband's memory. Her love was strong and pure and completely unselfish. "Harold," Margaret continued, "I hope you're proud of Michael. I know you are. I hope you understand why he can't visit more often. His life is so full now, so important." She was making excuses for her son, just as I had been making excuses for Nolan for years, protecting him even when he wasn't protecting her. Margaret placed the rose on Harold's grave and sat back in her wheelchair. "Thank you for bringing me here, Helene. I don't know what I would have done without you." "It was my pleasure," I said, and I meant it. For the first time all day, I felt like I had done something meaningful, something that mattered. As we sat there in the peaceful cemetery, Margaret turned to me with curious eyes. "Tell me about your son," she said gently. "What happened today?" And so I did. I told her about Tegan, about the rejection, about standing outside that tent while my son got married without me. I told her about the years of gradual exclusion, about always feeling like I wasn't good enough for the life Nolan had built with his new wife. Margaret listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, her eyes filled with understanding and compassion. "You know," she said when I finished, "Harold used to say that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Not because they want to, but because they forget that love isn't something to be ashamed of." "Maybe," I said, "but I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to make him see that I just want to be part of his life." Margaret was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. Then she smiled, a small, secretive smile that seemed to hold more than she was saying. "You know, dear," she said slowly, Michael may be too busy to visit, but he's a good man at heart. He's built something beautiful with his success. He helps people. I think if he knew what you did for me today, he would be very grateful. Very grateful indeed. There was something in her tone that made me look at her more closely, but before I could ask what she meant, she was already asking me to take her back to the bus stop. After helping Margaret to the bus stop and ensuring she got safely on her way back to the assisted living facility, I found myself facing a difficult decision. It was now late afternoon, and I knew the wedding reception would be in full swing. Margaret's words about love not being something to be ashamed of echoed in my mind, and despite everything that had happened, I felt compelled to return to the Whitmore estate. Maybe Tegan had been right about the ceremony. Maybe I truly didn't belong among those important guests during the formal proceedings. But surely at the reception, when things were more relaxed, I could find a quiet moment with Nolan. Surely I could at least congratulate my son and give him the gift I had brought. The walk back took nearly 45 minutes. My feet were screaming in protest by the time I reached the estate gates, and I knew I must look disheveled. My navy blue dress was wrinkled and damp with perspiration from pushing Margaret's wheelchair up that steep hill. My carefully styled hair had come completely undone, hanging in limp strands around my face. There was even a small tear in my pantyhose from where I had caught it on Margaret's wheelchair. But I pressed on, clutching the small wrapped gift I had bought for Nolan and Tegan, a crystal picture frame that had cost me $37 and represented weeks of careful budgeting. The reception was everything I had imagined it would be. The white tent glowed with warm light from hundreds of twinkling bulbs strung across the ceiling. Round tables draped in ivory linens were arranged around a polished dance floor, where couples swayed to music played by a live band. The smell of expensive food, prime rib, lobster, and elaborate desserts, wafted through the air, making my stomach growl since I hadn't eaten all day. I stood at the edge of the tent, looking for Nolan among the crowd of elegantly dressed guests. Everyone looked so perfect, so polished, so far removed from my world of discount stores and careful budgeting. I felt like an intruder, but I had come this far. Then I spotted him. Nolan stood near the head table, handsome in his black tuxedo, laughing at something one of his groomsmen was saying. For a moment, my heart swelled with maternal pride. This was my son, my baby, even if he no longer needed or wanted me in his life. I began walking toward him, weaving between the tables, trying to go unnoticed. But my appearance made stealth impossible. Conversations quieted as I passed, and I heard whispers following in my wake. Who is that woman? She looks terrible. How did she get in here? Is she one of the catering staff? I kept my eyes fixed on Nolan, determined to reach him before anyone could stop me. But I had only made it halfway across the tent when a voice cut through the air like a knife. Oh my God, what happened to you? The entire reception seemed to freeze. The band continued playing, but every conversation stopped as heads turned toward the source of the commotion. Tegan stood beside me, still radiant in her wedding dress, but her face was twisted with disgust and barely contained rage. Tegan, I said quietly, hoping to avoid a scene. I just wanted to congratulate Nolan and give him his gift. I won't stay long. Look at you. Her voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. She gestured at my appearance with barely concealed horror. You look like you've been rolling in dirt. Your hair is a disaster, your dress is filthy, and you smell like sweat and grass. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation. She wasn't wrong. I did look terrible. But I had looked this way because I had spent hours helping an elderly woman in need, not because I was careless or slovenly. I was helping someone, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. An elderly lady who needed assistance getting to the cemetery. Tegan let out a harsh laugh that carried across the tent. Of course you were. Playing the martyr again, aren't you? Always finding some excuse for your inability to maintain basic standards of appearance. More guests had stopped what they were doing to watch our exchange. I could see phones being discreetly raised as people began recording what they clearly expected to be an entertaining confrontation. "Tegan, please," I said. "I just want to see Nolan for a moment." "Absolutely not." Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "You are not ruining my reception with your… this." She waved her hand at my general appearance. "I told you this morning that you weren't welcome at the ceremony, and clearly that extends to the reception as well. Look at yourself. You're embarrassing everyone here." I glanced around and saw that she was right. Guests were staring at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to outright disgust. Some were whispering behind their hands, others were openly gawking. I had become a spectacle, a source of entertainment for these wealthy, powerful people who saw me as nothing more than a curiosity. "But I'm his mother," I said, hating how weak and desperate my voice sounded. "Mother?" Tegan's laugh was cruel and sharp. A real mother would have made sure she looked presentable for her son's wedding. A real mother would have had enough self-respect to dress appropriately and maintain some dignity. A real mother wouldn't show up looking like she just crawled out of a dumpster. Each word was designed to cut, and they found their mark with surgical precision. I felt tears beginning to well up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of these people who already thought so little of me. "Where is Nolan?" I asked, looking past her toward where I had seen him moments before. "He's busy," Tegan said curtly. "And frankly, he's ashamed enough already. Do you really think he wants to be associated with this?" She gestured at me again, and I caught sight of myself in one of the mirrored panels that decorated the tent. She was right. I looked terrible. My gray hair was hanging in sweaty strands around my face, my dress was wrinkled and stained, and there was dirt under my fingernails from helping Margaret. I looked exactly like what Tegan had called me, someone who had crawled out of a dumpster. "I think it's time for you to leave," Tegan continued, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent reception area. "This is a celebration for people who matter, for people who have achieved something with their lives. You don't belong here." "Tegan, that's enough." The voice came from behind me, and I turned to see Nolan approaching. My heart leaped with hope. Finally, my son would defend me, would tell his wife that she had gone too far. But when I saw his face, that hope died instantly. He looked embarrassed, yes, but not by Tegan's behavior. He was embarrassed by me. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "What are you doing here? Tegan told you this morning that it would be better if you didn't come." "I wanted to see you get married," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "I wanted to give you this." I held out the wrapped picture frame, but he didn't take it. "You're making a scene," he said, glancing around at the watching guests. "Look, I appreciate that you wanted to be here, but maybe it's just better this way." "Better this way?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Nolan, I'm your mother. I raised you. I worked 2 jobs to put you through college. I sacrificed everything to give you the opportunities you have now." "I know that," he said, but his voice held no warmth, no gratitude. "And I'm grateful. But this is my wedding day, and Tegan's right. You're not. You don't fit in here." The words hit me like physical blows. My own son, the child I had loved unconditionally for 42 years, was telling me I didn't belong at his wedding because I wasn't good enough. "I see," I said quietly. I set the gift on a nearby table, my hands shaking. "I understand perfectly." Tegan smiled triumphantly. "I'm glad we could clear this up. Perhaps next time you'll think twice before inserting yourself into situations where you clearly don't belong." I looked at my son one last time, memorizing his face, trying to see some trace of the loving boy he had once been. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who valued social standing more than the mother who had given him everything. "Goodbye, Nolan," I said. "I hope you have a wonderful marriage." I turned and walked away, my head held high despite the tears that were now flowing freely down my cheeks. Behind me, I heard the conversations gradually resume. the band pick up its tempo, and the normal sounds of celebration return. Within minutes, it would be as if I had never been there at all. I made my way to a small stone bench in the garden area outside the tent, where I could sit and collect myself before beginning the long walk home. The bench was positioned under a large oak tree, partially hidden from view by carefully maintained hedges. It seemed like an appropriate place for someone like me, out of sight, out of mind. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the shadows grow longer as the sun began to set. The reception continued without me, and through the open sides of the tent, I could see my son dancing with his new wife, laughing with his friends, celebrating the beginning of his new life. A life that clearly had no room for me. The tears had stopped, replaced by a deep, aching numbness. I felt hollow, emptied out, as if all the love and hope I had carried for years had simply drained away, leaving nothing behind but exhaustion. I was just gathering the energy to stand up and begin my walk home when I heard it, a sound that seemed impossibly out of place in this quiet garden setting. The rhythmic thump of helicopter blades cutting through the air, growing louder and closer with each passing second. I looked up, shading my eyes against the setting sun, and saw a sleek black helicopter approaching the estate. It circled once, then began to descend toward the large lawn area beyond the reception tent. The sound was deafening, and I could see guests pouring out of the tent to see what was happening. The helicopter touched down with surprising grace, its rotors gradually slowing as the engine wound down. For a moment, everything was still. Then the door opened, and a man stepped out. Even from a distance, I could see he was tall and well-dressed, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to making dramatic entrances. He spoke briefly to someone, perhaps the pilot, then began walking toward the reception area with purposeful steps. I couldn't make out his features from where I sat, but something about him seemed familiar. There was something about the way he carried himself, something about his bearing that reminded me of someone, though I couldn't quite place who. The guests had gathered near the edge of the tent, watching this unexpected arrival with curiosity and excitement. Even from my hidden spot in the garden, I could sense the buzz of speculation and intrigue that had replaced the earlier wedding celebration. Who was this man? Why had he arrived so dramatically? And why did I have the strangest feeling that his presence here was somehow connected to the events of this impossible day? From my position on the garden bench, I watched as the man from the helicopter walked toward the reception tent with measured, confident steps. The guests had formed a loose semicircle, their earlier wedding celebration temporarily forgotten in favor of this unexpected drama. I could hear the murmur of speculation even from where I sat hidden among the hedges. The stranger was indeed tall, probably in his mid-40s, with dark hair that was beginning to silver at the temples. He wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, and he moved with the kind of easy confidence that comes from success and authority. But there was something else in his bearing, a sense of purpose, of urgency, that suggested this wasn't a social call. As he approached the tent, I saw Tegan step forward, her wedding dress trailing behind her as she positioned herself to greet this important-looking visitor. Even from a distance, I could see her switch into what I had come to think of as her society mode. The bright smile, the perfectly poised posture, the calculated charm she deployed whenever someone potentially useful entered her orbit. "Good evening," I heard her say, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I'm Tegan Morrison, the bride. Welcome to our celebration, and you are." The man stopped a few feet from her, his eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that made several guests shift uncomfortably. When he spoke, his voice was deep and clear, with an authority that commanded immediate attention. "My name is Michael Patterson," he said. "I'm looking for someone, a woman named Helene Morrison." My heart nearly stopped. Margaret's son. The successful businessman she had spoken of so wistfully was here, looking for me. But why? How had he even known I was here? Tegan's smile faltered slightly at the mention of my name. I saw her glance quickly toward Nolan, who had appeared beside her with a look of confusion on his face. "Helene Morrison?" Tegan repeated, her tone carefully neutral. That's the groom's mother. May I ask why you're looking for her?" Michael Patterson's eyes hardened slightly. "She performed an extraordinary act of kindness for my mother today. I've come to thank her personally." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I could see guests turning to look at each other, trying to make sense of this unexpected development. Tegan's expression grew increasingly uncomfortable. "I see," she said carefully. "Well, I'm afraid Helene isn't here at the moment. She had to leave early." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. I was here, hidden in the garden, but I had been expelled from the reception in humiliation just an hour earlier. Michael's expression grew stern. "Had to leave early? From her own son's wedding?" "Well, yes," Tegan said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "It was a mutual decision. She felt that perhaps she didn't quite fit in with the other guests." I watched as Michael's jaw tightened. Something about Tegan's explanation clearly didn't sit well with him. "I find that hard to believe," he said, his voice cutting through the evening air like a blade. "The woman I'm looking for is someone who would climb a steep hill in 90-degree heat to help an elderly stranger reach her husband's grave. Someone who would sacrifice her own comfort, her own appearance, her own plans, to ensure that a lonely old woman could honor her deceased husband on their wedding anniversary. That woman doesn't strike me as someone who would abandon her own son's wedding because she didn't fit in." Tegan's face had gone pale beneath her perfect makeup. Several guests were now openly staring at her, and I could see confusion and suspicion beginning to dawn on their faces. "Perhaps," Michael continued, his voice growing colder, "someone decided for her that she didn't fit in." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Tegan opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Beside her, Nolan looked increasingly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between his new wife and this imposing stranger who seemed to see right through their carefully constructed facade. "Now," Michael said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm going to ask again, and I expect a truthful answer. Where is Helene Morrison?" Before Tegan could respond, I made a decision. I couldn't continue hiding in the garden while this man defended my honor to people who had spent the day treating me like an embarrassment. Whatever was happening here, whatever Margaret had told her son about me, I owed it to both of them to face it with dignity. I stood up from the bench, smoothed down my wrinkled dress as best I could, and walked out from behind the hedges. The crowd turned as one to look at me, and I saw Michael Patterson's eyes find mine immediately. "I'm Helene Morrison," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You're Margaret's son." The change in his expression was immediate and profound. The stern authority melted away, replaced by something that looked almost like reverence. He walked toward me, leaving the crowd of wedding guests behind, and I found myself walking to meet him halfway on the soft grass of the garden. When we were close enough to speak without the others hearing, he stopped and looked at me intently. I was acutely aware of my disheveled appearance, the wrinkled dress, the undone hair, the dirt under my fingernails. But instead of the disgust or embarrassment I had seen in so many eyes today, Michael Patterson's eyes held only gratitude and respect. "Mrs. Morrison," he said softly, "I cannot begin to tell you what you did for my mother today." I shook my head. It was nothing. She needed help and I was there. Anyone would have done the same. "No," he said firmly. "Not anyone. Most people would have walked past an elderly woman struggling with a wheelchair. Most people would have been too busy, too concerned with their own problems, too afraid of getting involved. But you stopped. You spent hours helping a complete stranger reach a place that meant everything to her." I felt tears beginning to well up in my eyes again, but these were different from the tears of humiliation I had shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, of being truly seen and valued for the first time in years. "She called me," Michael continued, his voice thick with emotion. An hour ago. She was crying, Mrs. Morrison. My mother, who never complains, who never asks for anything, was crying because a stranger had shown her more kindness in one afternoon than she had received from her own family in months. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single red rose. Perfect, fresh, beautiful. She told me to give you this. She said it was for the angel who helped her visit my father. With infinite gentleness, he took my dirty, work-roughened hand and pressed the rose into my palm. Then, to my complete shock, he lifted my hand to his lips and kissed it softly, as if I were a queen instead of a woman in a wrinkled discount dress. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for seeing her humanity when so many others have looked right through her." I was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the kindness of this gesture, by the recognition of my worth that had been so brutally denied just hours earlier. "She's a wonderful woman," I managed to say through my tears. "She loves you so much. She's so proud of everything you've accomplished." Michael's face crumpled slightly. "I know, and I've been a terrible son. Too busy building my career to remember that success means nothing if you forget the people who made it possible." He looked past me toward the reception, where Tegan and Nolan still stood frozen, watching our interaction with expressions of growing alarm. The other guests had begun to whisper among themselves, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but not quite understanding what. "Mrs. Morrison," Michael said, his voice growing stronger. "My mother told me what happened to you today. How you were turned away from your own son's wedding, how you were made to feel ashamed of who you are." I looked down at the rose in my hands, its petals soft and perfect against my dirty fingers. "It's complicated," I said quietly. "No," he said firmly. "It's not complicated at all. It's simple cruelty dressed up as social necessity. And it's unacceptable." He turned to face the crowd of wedding guests, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Mrs. Helene Morrison. This morning, while you were all celebrating inside that tent, she was outside performing an act of selfless kindness that would make angels weep. She spent hours helping my elderly mother reach my father's grave so she could honor his memory on their wedding anniversary." The crowd stirred uneasily. Several guests looked genuinely confused, trying to reconcile the image of the disheveled woman they had seen earlier with this man's description of heroic kindness. "While you were judging her appearance," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger, "she was demonstrating the kind of character that most people only pretend to possess. While you were whispering about her unworthiness to be here, she was proving that true worth has nothing to do with clothes or social status, and everything to do with how we treat those who need our help." Tegan stepped forward, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mr. Patterson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is a private family matter, and I don't think—" "There's no misunderstanding," Michael cut her off, his voice like ice. "I understand perfectly. You excluded this remarkable woman from her own son's wedding because she didn't meet your shallow standards of appearance and social standing. You humiliated her publicly for having the audacity to love her child despite not being wealthy enough to suit your tastes." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several guests gasped audibly, and I saw more than one person reach for their phones, clearly recognizing that this confrontation would be talked about for years to come. Nolan stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "Now, wait just a minute. You don't know anything about our family situation. You can't just come here and—" "I know enough," Michael said, turning his full attention to my son. "I know that your mother raised you alone. I know that she worked herself to the bone to give you opportunities. I know that she loved you unconditionally for 42 years. And I know that today, instead of honoring that sacrifice, you allowed your wife to exclude her from the most important day of your life because she wasn't sophisticated enough for your new social circle." Nolan's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Around us, The wedding guests watched in fascination as their elegant celebration transformed into a moral reckoning. Michael reached into his jacket again and pulled out a business card, which he handed to me. Mrs. Morrison, I run a foundation that helps elderly and disadvantaged people maintain their dignity and independence. I would be honored, truly honored, if you would consider joining our team. We need people with your compassion, your strength, and your understanding of what it means to lift others up instead of tearing them down. I looked down at the card, then back up at this extraordinary man who had seen my worth when my own family couldn't. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, he said gently. Say you'll remember that there are people in this world who recognize true value when they see it. He glanced once more at the assembled wedding guests, his expression making it clear what he thought of their priorities and values. Then he turned back to me with a smile that was warm and genuine. My helicopter is waiting, Mrs. Morrison. May I offer you a ride home? I accepted Michael's offer of a helicopter ride home, partly because I was exhausted and my feet were killing me, but mostly because I wanted to escape the stares and whispers of the wedding guests who were now seeing me in an entirely different light. As we lifted off from the Whitmore estate, I looked down at the reception tent growing smaller below us, at the people who had spent the day treating me like an embarrassment. The flight to my modest apartment complex took only 10 minutes, but it felt like crossing into an entirely different world. Michael was quiet during the journey, perhaps sensing that I needed time to process everything that had happened. When we landed in the small parking lot behind my building, he helped me out of the helicopter with the same careful respect he had shown me at the wedding. Mrs. Morrison, he said as we stood beside the aircraft, its rotors slowly winding down. I want you to know that my offer was sincere. We genuinely need someone like you at the Patterson Foundation. I looked down at the business card he had given me earlier, still clutched in my hand along with the red rose. Michael, I appreciate what you did back there, defending me and all. But I'm 69 years old. I have no experience with foundations or charitable work. I'm not sure I'm what you're looking for. He smiled, and I could see so much of Margaret's warmth in his expression. Mrs. Morrison, you spent your afternoon pushing my mother up a steep hill in 90-degree heat so she could visit my father's grave. You sacrificed your own comfort, your own appearance at your son's wedding, to help a stranger honor her deceased husband. That tells me everything I need to know about your qualifications. But I don't have a college degree, I said. I never worked in an office. I was a waitress for 30 years, then worked in a nursing home until I retired. Perfect, he said. You understand what it means to serve others, to work hard for modest pay, to be overlooked by people who think they're better than you. Our foundation works with elderly people who have been abandoned by their families, who struggle with poverty and loneliness. Who better to help them than someone who understands exactly what they're going through? I felt tears welling up in my eyes again. After a lifetime of being told I wasn't good enough, smart enough, sophisticated enough, here was this successful, powerful man telling me that my experiences, the very experiences my family was ashamed of, were exactly what made me valuable. The position pays $4,000 a month, Michael continued. It includes health insurance and a retirement supplement. But more than that, it would give you the chance to help people who desperately need someone who understands their struggles. $4,000 a month, nearly 5 times my current pension. The number was so staggering that I almost couldn't process it. With that kind of income, I could move to a better apartment, maybe even buy a small car. I could stop worrying about choosing between groceries and medication. I need to think about it, I said, though my heart was already singing with possibility. Of course, Michael said. Take all the time you need. But please, don't let anyone convince you that you're not worthy of this opportunity. My mother called you an angel, Mrs. Morrison. In my experience, angels are exactly what the world needs more of. After he left, I sat in my small apartment, still wearing my wrinkled wedding dress, holding the red rose and staring at the business card. The silence felt different than it had that morning, not empty and lonely, but peaceful and full of potential. 3 days later, the phone calls started. The first was from Nolan. I almost didn't answer when I saw his name on my caller ID, but curiosity got the better of me. Mom? His voice sounded strained, uncertain. Can we talk? About what, Nolan? I kept my voice calm, neutral. About what happened at the wedding. About Mr. Patterson. About everything. I waited, saying nothing. Look, Mom, I think there might have been some misunderstandings. Tegan feels terrible about how things went, and we both want to make things right. Tegan feels terrible? I couldn't keep the skepticism out of my voice. She does. She's been crying for 3 days. She says she never meant for things to go as far as they did. I found that hard to believe, but I listened as Nolan continued. The thing is, some of our wedding guests have been talking about Mr. Patterson, about what he said about you. Word is getting around about his foundation, about how successful he is. People are asking questions about why you weren't at the ceremony, about how we've been treating you. Ah, there it was. This wasn't about remorse or family love. This was about damage control. Mom, we'd really like to have you over for dinner this weekend. Tegan wants to apologize in person, and we want to discuss how we can move forward as a family. Move forward, I repeated. Yes. We've been thinking that maybe we could include you more in our lives. Maybe have you over for dinner once a week, or take you out for your birthday. We want to make sure you feel valued. I almost laughed at the irony. For years, I had begged for exactly this, to be included, to be valued, to be treated like family. Now, when a successful businessman had publicly recognized my worth, suddenly my own son wanted to make sure I felt valued. That's very thoughtful of you, Nolan, I said carefully. But I've been offered a position with the Patterson Foundation. I'll be quite busy. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. A position? Nolan finally said. What kind of position? A senior coordinator role, working with elderly clients who need assistance maintaining their independence and dignity. Mom, that's wonderful, he said, but his tone suggested he found it anything but wonderful. How much does something like that pay? I hesitated, then decided to be honest. $4,000 a month. Another long silence. $4,000. Mom, that's nearly $50,000 a year. Are you sure this is legitimate? I mean, no offense, but you don't have the kind of experience that usually commands that salary. Michael Patterson seems to think I have exactly the experience they need, I said quietly. Michael Patterson, Nolan repeated, and I could hear him processing the implications. Mom, you need to be careful. This could be some kind of scam, or maybe he feels guilty about what happened at the wedding and he's making promises he can't keep. It's not a scam, Nolan. I've already spoken with their human resources department. I start on Monday. The truth was, I had called Michael the day after the wedding and accepted his offer. The conversation with their HR department had been more encouraging than any job interview I'd ever had. They weren't interested in my lack of formal education or my modest work history. They wanted to know about my experience caring for my elderly residents at the nursing home, about my understanding of the challenges facing seniors in America, about my ability to connect with people who felt forgotten by society. Mom, listen, Nolan said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I remembered from his teenage years. Why don't you come to dinner this Sunday and we can discuss this job offer? Tegan has some connections in the business world. Maybe she can help you evaluate whether this is really in your best interest. The audacity of it took my breath away. The same woman who had humiliated me at my son's wedding, who had told me I was too embarrassing to be seen with their important guests, now wanted to help me evaluate a job offer from one of those very guests. I appreciate the concern, Nolan, but I'm quite capable of making my own decisions. Of course you are, he said quickly. I just think it would be good for us to talk. as a family, about everything. Family. The word that had once meant everything to me now left a bitter taste in my mouth. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up. The second call came from Tegan herself 2 days later. Her voice was sweetness and light, as if the scene at the wedding had never happened. "Helene, how are you, dear? Nolan told me about your wonderful job opportunity. I'm so excited for you." I said nothing, waiting to see where this was going. I've been feeling just terrible about the misunderstanding at our wedding. I know I came across as harsh, but I was just so stressed about everything being perfect. "You know how brides can be." She laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "The truth is, Helene, I've always admired your independence and your strength. When Nolan told me about all the sacrifices you made to raise him, I was just amazed. I mean, working 2 jobs, putting yourself through all that hardship, it's really inspiring." Funny how my inspiring sacrifices had seemed like such an embarrassment when she thought I was poor and powerless. "Anyway," Tegan continued, "I was hoping we could get together soon, just the 2 of us. Maybe go shopping or have lunch at that new bistro downtown. I feel like we've never really had a chance to get to know each other properly." "That's very kind of you, Tegan," I said, "but I'm afraid I'll be quite busy with my new job." "Oh, of course. But surely you'll have some free time. And Helene, I have to ask, is it true that Michael Patterson's foundation pays $4,000 a month? Because if so, that's just incredible. Nolan and I have been talking, and we think it would be wonderful if you moved closer to us. Maybe found a nice place in our neighborhood. Now that you'll be making good money, you could afford something really lovely." I almost choked. 6 months ago, they wouldn't return my phone calls. 3 months ago, Tegan had joked that I should consider moving to a senior living facility because I was getting to that age. Now, suddenly, they wanted me to move to their expensive neighborhood. "We've actually been looking at some properties for you," Tegan continued. "There's a beautiful condo complex just 2 miles from our house. The units are around $300,000, which would be perfect now that you have this new income. You could get a mortgage, and we could help you with the down payment. Help me with the down payment, with money that would ultimately be paid back through my new salary. How generous." "I've also been thinking about family holidays," she went on, "now that things are different. Maybe you could host Christmas dinner this year, in your new place. We could invite some of our friends. They'd love to meet Michael Patterson's newest employee." There it was. The real reason for this sudden change of heart. Michael Patterson was important, successful, connected. If I worked for him, I became a valuable asset instead of an embarrassing liability. "Tegan," I said quietly, "where was this interest in including me in family gatherings 3 days ago?" "Oh, Helene," she said, her voice taking on a wounded tone. "I thought we were past all that. I've apologized and I'm trying to make things right. Isn't that what matters?" "You haven't apologized," I pointed out. "You've explained. There's a difference." Silence. "You're right," she said finally. "I owe you a real apology. Why don't you come to dinner Sunday night? I'll cook your favorite meal and we can talk properly. As family." My favorite meal. I wondered if she even knew what my favorite meal was. I doubted she had ever bothered to ask. "I'll consider it," I said and hung up. That evening, I called Margaret. We had exchanged phone numbers before she left the cemetery that day, and she had called twice since the wedding to check on me and to thank me again for my help. "Helene!" Her voice was warm and delighted. "How are you, dear? Michael told me about your new job. I'm so thrilled for you." "Thank you, Margaret. I have to admit I'm a little nervous about it." "Nervous? Why? You'll be wonderful. Michael has been talking about you non-stop. He says you're exactly what the foundation needs, someone with a heart for helping people." We chatted for a while about the job, about her health, about the beautiful flowers that had appeared on Harold's grave. Apparently, Michael had arranged for a service to maintain it. "Margaret," I said finally, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, dear." "Your son, Michael, was he always so thoughtful? So concerned about doing the right thing? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Actually, no, she said softly. For years, he was very much like your son. Successful, busy, focused on his career. He visited rarely, called infrequently. I think success can sometimes make people forget where they came from. What changed? His father's death, she said simply. Michael was traveling when Harold passed away. He missed the funeral because he was in Europe closing some important business deal. He came home to find that I had buried his father without him, that I had spent those last days in the hospital alone while he was pursuing profit. I felt a chill of recognition. It broke something in him, Margaret continued. He realized that all the money and success in the world couldn't buy back time with the people you love. That's when he started the foundation, and that's when he began really taking care of me. Do you think people can really change? I asked. I think grief and loss can open people's eyes, she said. But Helene, change has to come from within. It has to be genuine. You can't force someone to love you the way you deserve to be loved. After I hung up, I sat in my small living room, thinking about Margaret's words. Could Nolan really change? Could he genuinely come to value me for who I was, rather than for what I might be able to offer him now? Or was this sudden interest in reconciliation just another form of exploitation, dressed up in the language of family love? On Sunday morning, I made my decision. I called Nolan and accepted the dinner invitation. But I had no illusions about what I would find there. I was going not because I believed they had changed, but because I wanted to see for myself just how far they were willing to go in their attempt to reconnect with me now that I had become potentially useful to them. It was time to discover whether my family's newfound interest in me was based on love or opportunism. Sunday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. I dressed carefully for dinner at Nolan and Tegan's house, choosing a simple black dress I had owned for years but had rarely worn. It wasn't expensive or fashionable, but it was dignified, and dignity was all I needed now. Their house was in Maple Heights, an upscale subdivision where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every driveway held at least one luxury car. I had only been there twice before, once for a brief holiday visit that had been awkward and strained, and once when I had helped them move in, carrying boxes while Tegan supervised from her chair, worried about breaking her newly manicured nails. As I rang the doorbell, I could smell something delicious wafting from inside. Whatever Tegan's faults, she was an excellent cook when she chose to be. The door opened almost immediately, as if they had been watching for me. "Mom!" Nolan's voice was overly enthusiastic, the kind of forced cheer people use when they're trying too hard. Come in, come in. You look wonderful." Tegan appeared beside him, and I had to admit she looked genuinely nervous. Her perfect hair was slightly mussed, and there were actual worry lines around her eyes. She was wearing a casual sweater and jeans, the first time I had ever seen her dressed down. "Helene," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Thank you so much for coming. I've made your favorite, pot roast with carrots and potatoes." I almost pointed out that pot roast wasn't my favorite, that honor belonged to my mother's recipe for chicken and dumplings. But I held my tongue. The effort was what mattered, even if it was misguided. Their dining room was elegant but cold, decorated in shades of white and gray that looked expensive but felt unwelcoming. The table was set with their wedding china, and there were fresh flowers in the center, white lilies that must have cost $50. "Please sit anywhere you'd like," Tegan said, gesturing to the chairs. "Can I get you some wine? We have a lovely Cabernet that Nolan brought back from Napa." "Just water, please," I said, settling into a chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The meal was delicious. I had to give Tegan that. The pot roast was tender and perfectly seasoned, the vegetables cooked just right. But the conversation felt stilted, artificial, as if all three of us were reading from a script. "So, Mom," Nolan said as we ate, "tell us more about this new job. What exactly will you be doing?" I set down my fork and looked at him carefully. I'll be working with elderly clients who need assistance maintaining their independence. Many of them have been abandoned by their families, or they're struggling with poverty and loneliness. That sounds very rewarding, Tegan said, but her voice held a note I couldn't quite identify. And the salary is really $4,000 a month? Yes. That's just incredible, she continued. Nolan and I have been talking, and we think this is such a wonderful opportunity for you. Not just the money, but the chance to work for such a prestigious organization. Prestigious, I repeated. Oh yes, Nolan jumped in. Michael Patterson is incredibly well connected. His foundation works with some of the most influential people in the city. The networking opportunities alone could be invaluable. There it was. They weren't interested in the work I would be doing or the people I would be helping. They were interested in the connections I might be able to provide. Mom, Tegan said, leaning forward with what I'm sure she thought was sincere enthusiasm. We've been thinking about how wonderful it would be to have you more involved in our lives now. Maybe you could join us for dinner every Sunday. And holidays, of course. We'd love to have you for Thanksgiving and Christmas. That's very thoughtful, I said neutrally. And we've been looking at some properties for you, Nolan added. There's a beautiful condo complex just a few miles from here. The units are around $300,000, but with your new salary, you could easily qualify for a mortgage. We could even help with the down payment, Tegan said quickly. Consider it a family investment. A family investment, I echoed. Yes. And Helene, I have to tell you, I've been bragging about you to all my friends, about how you're working for Michael Patterson now, about what an impressive woman you are. Everyone wants to meet you. I took a sip of water, buying myself time to process what I was hearing. 6 months ago, these same friends had heard nothing but complaints about Nolan's embarrassing mother. Now I was impressive and worth bragging about. You know, Tegan continued, her voice growing more animated, we should have a dinner party soon. Invite some of our closest friends. Let them meet you properly. I could make that salmon dish you love, and maybe you could tell everyone about your work with the foundation. Salmon wasn't my favorite either, but I was beginning to understand that Tegan's knowledge of my preferences was about as deep as her newfound affection for me. And Mom, Nolan said, we were thinking you might want to consider changing your last name back to Morrison Patterson. You know, to reflect your connection to the foundation. It would look good on business cards. I set down my water glass with enough force that it clinked against the table. Both of them looked at me with startled expressions. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, my voice calm but cold. 3 weeks ago, I wasn't good enough to attend my own son's wedding because I might embarrass you in front of your important friends. Tegan told me I looked like I had crawled out of a dumpster and that I didn't belong in civilized society. You, Nolan, stood by and watched as your wife humiliated me publicly, and then you told me I didn't fit in with your new life. Their faces had gone pale. Now, I continued, because a successful businessman has offered me a job and publicly recognized my worth, suddenly I'm impressive enough to brag about. You want me to move to your neighborhood, host dinner parties with your friends, and essentially become a trophy you can display to show how well-connected you are. Mom, that's not... Nolan started. Let me finish, I said, my voice cutting through his protest like a blade. You're not interested in me as a person. You're not sorry for the years of neglect and dismissal. You're not even genuinely apologetic for what happened at the wedding. You're interested in what I can do for you now that I have value in your social circle. Tegan's carefully composed expression had crumbled. Helene, please, you're misunderstanding our intentions. We genuinely want to make things right. Do you? I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against their expensive hardwood floor. Then let me ask you this, Tegan. What's my favorite color? She blinked, clearly caught off guard. What? My favorite color. If you genuinely care about me, if you want to build a real relationship, surely you know something as basic as my favorite color. Silence. What about my birthday, Nolan? When is your mother's birthday? My son's face went red. Mom, that's not fair. I'm terrible with dates. You remember Tegan's birthday. You remember your anniversary. You remember the birthdays of your college friends and your business associates. But you can't remember when your own mother was born. I walked around the table, looking at these two people who had spent the evening trying to convince me they cared about me. Here's what I think happened, I said, my voice steady and clear. After Michael Patterson publicly defended me at your wedding, your friends started asking questions. They started wondering why such an obviously successful and respected man was so concerned about a woman you had excluded from your celebration. They started to question your judgment, your character, your values. Neither of them denied it. You realized that being associated with someone Michael Patterson respects could be beneficial for your career, your social standing, your business connections. So you decided to repair our relationship, not out of love or genuine remorse, but out of calculated self-interest. Mom, please, Nolan said, his voice breaking slightly. It's not that simple. Isn't it? I picked up my purse, preparing to leave. Nolan, I spent 42 years loving you unconditionally. I worked 2 jobs to put you through college. I sacrificed my own dreams, my own comfort, my own future to give you every opportunity I could afford. And the moment you achieved success, you decided I was an embarrassment to be hidden away. Tears were streaming down his face now, but I felt no satisfaction in causing them. I don't need your friendship now that I have value in your world, I continued. I don't need your approval now that someone else has given it to me. And I certainly don't need you to help me spend the money I'm earning by working with people who have been abandoned by their families. People exactly like me. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Here's what's going to happen, I said. I'm going to start my new job on Monday. I'm going to help elderly people who have been discarded by their children maintain their dignity and independence. I'm going to build a life surrounded by people who value kindness over status, character over connections. I looked directly at Tegan. And you're going to tell your friends whatever story makes you feel better about yourselves. Maybe you'll say I'm ungrateful. Maybe you'll say I'm bitter. Maybe you'll find a way to make this my fault, the way you made everything else my fault for the past 5 years. Then I turned to Nolan, and for a moment, I let him see the love I still carried for him despite everything. I will always be your mother, I said softly. And if you ever decide you want a real relationship, one based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than social advantage, my door will be open. But I will never again accept being treated as less than I am just to make you comfortable. I walked out of their house and into the crisp autumn evening. Behind me, I could hear Tegan crying and Nolan calling my name, but I didn't turn back. 3 months later, I sat in my new office at the Patterson Foundation, reviewing case files for the elderly clients I would be visiting that week. My desk was simple but comfortable, positioned near a window that looked out over the city. On the wall hung a photograph that Margaret had given me, a picture of her and Harold on their wedding day, both of them young and radiant with hope. My work at the foundation had exceeded even Michael's expectations. I had a natural gift for connecting with elderly clients who felt forgotten by the world, for helping them navigate the complex systems of healthcare and social services, for simply listening when they needed someone to care. My salary had been raised to $4,500 a month after just 6 weeks, and I had been given my own assistant, a young social worker named David, who reminded me a little of Nolan at that age, before success had hardened his heart. I had moved to a small but comfortable apartment closer to the foundation's offices. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, paid for with money I had earned through work that mattered. The neighborhood was diverse and friendly, full of people who judged others by their character rather than their bank accounts. Margaret and I had become close friends. She visited my office every few weeks, and I often stopped by her assisted living facility for dinner. Michael had also become a regular part of my life, not as a boss, but as the son I had always wished Nolan could be. Respectful, grateful for his mother's sacrifices, committed to using his success to help others, rather than to elevate himself above them. Nolan had called twice in those 3 months. The first time, about 6 weeks after our dinner, he had left a voicemail apologizing for his behavior and asking if we could try again. The second call had come just the week before, and this time I had answered. "Mom," he had said, his voice smaller and more vulnerable than I had heard it since he was a child. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About how I treated you, about the kind of person I became." "And?" I had asked, keeping my voice neutral. "And you were right, about all of it. I did abandon you the moment I achieved success. I did let Tegan convince me you were an embarrassment. I did choose status over family. Yes, you did. I want to make it right," he had continued. "Not because of your job or your connections or anything like that. Because I miss my mom. I miss the woman who stayed up all night when I was sick, who worked double shifts to buy me school clothes, who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." I had listened to the tears in his voice, and for a moment, my heart had softened. "I don't know if it's too late," he had whispered. "I don't know if I've destroyed something that can't be repaired." "I don't know either, Nolan," I had told him honestly. "But if you want to try, really try, not just when it's convenient or advantageous, then maybe we can find our way back to each other." "How?" he had asked. "Slowly," I had said. "With respect, with honesty, with an understanding that love isn't something you can turn on and off based on circumstances." We had agreed to start with lunch the following week. Just the two of us, no agenda other than trying to remember what it felt like to be mother and son instead of disappointment and embarrassment. I didn't know if Nolan's remorse was genuine or if it would last. I didn't know if we could rebuild a relationship that had been damaged by years of neglect and deliberate cruelty. But I was willing to try, because that's what mothers do. We love even when it hurts. We hope even when hope seems foolish. We keep our doors open even when we're not sure anyone will walk through them. But this time would be different. This time, I would love him from a position of strength rather than desperation. This time, I would demand the respect I had always deserved but had been too afraid to insist upon. As I sat in my office that afternoon, reviewing the file of an 80-year-old woman whose children had stopped visiting her 2 years ago, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. A year ago, I had been a lonely widow counting pennies and begging for scraps of attention from a son who was ashamed of me. Now, I was a respected professional, a valued friend, a woman who had found her purpose and her voice. The transformation hadn't come from winning the lottery or marrying a rich man, or any of the fairy tale solutions people dream about. It had come from a single act of kindness, helping a stranger reach her husband's grave on their anniversary. That act had been witnessed by someone who understood its value, who saw character where others saw only poverty and age. But most importantly, it had reminded me of my own worth. Not my worth as determined by others, but my inherent value as a human being who had spent her life caring for people, sacrificing for family, and choosing kindness even when kindness wasn't returned. I picked up the phone to call Mrs. Henderson, the 80-year-old whose file I had been reading. She answered on the second ring, her voice brightening when she heard my name. "Helene, how wonderful to hear from you. Are we still on for Tuesday?" "Absolutely," I said, smiling as I looked out my window at the city below. "I'm looking forward to it." And I was. Because this was my life now, a life built on purpose rather than desperation, on giving rather than begging, on the understanding that true value comes from how we treat others, especially when no one is watching. I had learned that sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to walk away from people who don't appreciate us, in order to make room for those who do. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, the people we walked away from find the wisdom to appreciate us again. But whether they do or not, we survive. We thrive. We discover that our worth was never dependent on their recognition, and our happiness was never contingent on their approval. The red rose Michael had given me sat on my desk in a small vase, still fresh after 3 months because I replaced it every week. Not as a reminder of that painful day, but as a symbol of the truth I had finally learned. That kindness is never wasted. That character matters more than status. And that sometimes the person you're meant to help leads you to the life you were always meant to live. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.